Now remember this. When the horizon's at the bottom, it's interesting. When the horizon's at the top, it's interesting. When the horizon's in the middle, it's boring as shit.
Undoubtedly, that clip sums up who John Ford really was. An artist, yes, and an auteur too. But when you get down to it, he was just an aggressive guy who wanted to make exciting movies. In case you're new here, this is part 2 of 2 on a John Ford video essay. In the last video, I made the case for Ford being more than just a legendary filmmaker. I argued he was a great one too. He was, in short, an entertainer, as much interested in making art as he was in making a salary. Ultimately, I think that way of making movies allowed him to jump around and blend so many genres effortlessly. Although westerns were his pride and joy, Ford could have a year like 1939, where he made 3 films with western settings, but every film was vastly different than the others. They were Stagecoach, Young Mr. Lincoln, and Drums Along the Mohawk, 3 of the finest films ever made, full stop. All 3 were nominated for Oscars, 10 in total. And if you ask me, it's a toss-up for which is the best of them. Stagecoach was Ford's grand return to the Western, although it could very well be argued that Stagecoach kicked off an entirely new type of Western. When you think of Westerns, you probably think of 10, 20, or 50 films, which are indebted to Stagecoach. It was Ford's first use of Monument Valley, the landscape which dominates nearly every mental image of the West, as well as Ford's first collaboration with John Wayne in a leading role. They'd have 23 more collaborations, and again, ask any person on the streets to name a cowboy, and they're likely to name Wayne. It's also just a really, really good movie. Reportedly, Orson Welles screened it 40 times before making Citizen Kane, citing Stagecoach as a monumental influence on Kane. Stagecoach follows an ensemble cast on their way to Lordsburg. The journey is a perilous one through Apache territory, and the tracking shots that Ford utilizes during the most daring sequences are jaw-dropping and better staged than 99% of movies made sense. The ensemble is full of memorable characters. Doc Boone, the alcoholic, Lucy Mallory, a young pregnant woman whose presence adds some welcome, beautiful scenes, the coachman, Buck, with Andy Devine oscillating his voice like a slide whistle because why not? It certainly adds a memorable element to his character. Of course, there's others, a banker, a whiskey salesman, a saloon girl named Dallas, but most importantly, there's Ringo, also known as John Wayne. He comes last, and his entrance, a fast dolly into a close-up, is one of the most iconic shots ever put to celluloid. These characters aren't cardboard cutouts either. They're fleshed out, and they change over the course of their Stagecoach journey. The film was made out of Ford's own pocket, as David O. Selznick thought the Western was on its way out. And he was probably right, until John Ford came along. Call this movie the shot in the arm for Westerns, or call it the birth of Westerns themselves. But whatever you call it, just give it respect. Stagecoach is the Western myth, born and memorialized. It is a triumph. Yet, perhaps Young Mr. Lincoln is even better. If Wayne was the macho half of Ford we discussed in the last video, Henry Fonda was his sensible half. He was in both Lincoln and Drums Along the Mohawk this year, though Lincoln gave him the more memorable role. Abraham himself. Sergei Eisenstein once lauded this film for its unity, artistry, and genuine beauty, saying that it was the only American film he wished he had directed himself. It truly is a beautiful and exceptional work. In some ways, it's really hard to even write why this film resonates so much. There's just a quality to it, where every scene, every shot, every subtle move of blocking or the wind itself seems to have such a measured point to it, but done as if they weren't trying at all. For a long time, it was my favorite Ford film, and maybe it still is, but I can't exactly articulate why. Few people can explain why this film works so well. An entire special issue of the French cinema magazine Cahiers du Cinema attempted to do a scene-by-scene breakdown of Young Mr. Lincoln, and even the full force of their analysis sort of misses the mark. This is just a legend put to film. Like how Stagecoach feels like a myth itself, Lincoln feels like a parable. It's not your standard biopic, and there's beautiful lyricism to the sequences which Ford chooses to highlight of Abraham's life. Sequences like when Lincoln visits the grave of his beloved Anne, or as he sprawls out on a riverbank with a law book. When you're watching Young Mr. Lincoln, everything just seems to fade away. You forget you're watching a movie. It just feels like magic. But at last, there's Drums Along the Mohawk, which was the commercial hit Ford needed. Granted, he wasn't floundering, but if he'd already completely revitalized an entire genre and produced the greatest biopic of all time in 1 year, why couldn't he also make a box office juggernaut too? It was a rousing adventure, which a lot of people cite as one of their favorite Ford films. And I'll be honest, of course it's the worst of these three, but you could put any movie in the world against Stagecoach and Young Mr. Lincoln, and it'd likely rank third. Mohawk is still a great movie with the exceptional debut of Ford's try at Technicolor. The beautiful costumes, nature shots, and cinematography are perfect for those who just love the visual medium of film. And as for the story, a romantic dramatization of a couple settling into a demanding frontier life is pretty endearing too. I like this movie a lot, and it's still a really good use of an afternoon. Overall, Ford's 1939 was simply a legendary year, up there with Spielberg's 1993, Coppola's 1974, or Soderbergh's 2000. And more than that, it kicked off Ford's height as a filmmaker. He had mastered his genres, his abilities, and he was making the most interesting films he'd ever made. They weren't just amazingly well made, they were so entertaining too. Ford had found the horizon, and now he was galloping full steam ahead towards it. Ford made 4 more films prior to World War II, and to say that he was continuing the highs that came before would be an understatement. In 1940, he made The Grapes of Wrath and The Long Voyage Home, and in 1941, he made Tobacco Road and How Green Was My Valley. Altogether, those 4 films were nominated for 23 Academy Awards across the 1941 and 42 ceremonies. They won 7, including Ford winning Best Director in both ceremonies, and How Green Was My Valley beating out Citizen Kane for Best Picture. Across nearly every list of the greatest films of all time, you'll find both Grapes of Wrath and Valley, and they're both recognized by the United States National Film Registry for being culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. The Long Voyage Home, though not part of the National Film Registry, is notable for a number of reasons too. The film follows a group of lonely seamen on their melancholy journey home. It features one of John Wayne's best performances as a young Swedish sailor who dearly misses his mother. And it was shot by Gregg Toland, who classic film fans know as the man who would revolutionize cinema when he shot Citizen Kane the very next year. Orson Welles had a grand gesture to share his title card with Toland in the opening of Citizen Kane, but he took that idea from Ford, who did it the year prior with Voyage Home. And to that point, anything Kane's cinematography did feels indebted to this shoot first. And I'd wager that it's just because Ford also made possibly the greatest film of all time in 1940 with The Grapes of Wrath that people have glossed over The Long Voyage Home. It's too bad though, this film is magnificent and woefully underrated. But let's not bury the lead. The Grapes of Wrath is undoubtedly one of the greatest films ever made. The American Film Institute said it was the 21st best film of all time, just ahead of 2001: A Space Odyssey. It was also shot by Gregg Toland, scored by the legendary Alfred Newman, and somehow managed the impossible feat of every cast member being so uniformly excellent that it feels like a disservice to highlight Henry Fonda or Jane Darwell as Tom and Ma Jode, though both were nominated for Oscars. Of course, the film and story is so well known that it feels useless to repeat it, but in case you haven't seen or read The Grapes of Wrath, you should know that it follows the Jode family on their journey out of Oklahoma. The story is set during the Great Depression and arouses great sympathy for the struggles of farm workers. It's a story about community, hope, and about the way that people unite in their struggles to rely on one another. In short, it's a bona fide American classic novel that everyone should read, but equally important for being one of the greatest films ever made. Every shot, every scene, and especially every character struck a chord with me. I may end up saying this a lot in this video, but this is probably my personal favorite Ford film. By now, you may have noticed that Ford's last pre-war films are all marked by working class themes, and that certainly carries over into 1941's output. Tobacco Road is definitely the weakest of these 4 films, but it was very successful at the box office, in some ways mirroring the way that Ford dominated 1939 critically and commercially. I have no issues with Tobacco Road, and even rank it higher than most would, but it is fair to say that How Green Was My Valley is not only better, but one of Ford's greatest films. And according to the Academy, the best film of 1941, ahead of Citizen Kane, Sergeant York, The Maltese Falcon, and others. How Green Was My Valley brims with themes of working class perseverance, but I think the bigger story here is just how stunning the images are. The compositions, the imagery, the framing, they all seriously evoke paintings. You have these portraits of a mine shaft spewing smoke with daunting miners' faces inside, or a sky frequently admired by the camera even as the black smoke of a mine infects the blue above. Many reviewers will attach themselves to an image or two here which made them cry, and I'm no different. When Mr. Gruffydd stands between the gravestones during the wedding, I cried. Yes, many people cited it as one of the best films of all time, but I wouldn't go that far. I would say, however, that How Green Was My Valley is maybe the most gorgeous film ever made. Akin to Terrence Malick, but with the usual Ford sentimentality we've come to love by now. It's a perfect combo that makes Valley unforgettable, timeless, and a fair contender for Citizen Kane's crown. As I said before, John Ford had found the horizon, and nothing could stop this legendary reign. Oh, yeah. The year is now 1942. Ford has 40 more works in him, but now we'll begin to see a shift in what he's making. No longer just films. There were now a number of wartime documentaries, war footage, and public service announcements which Ford was enlisted to make by the United States Navy. It feels fitting to highlight how incredible it was that Ford was hired by the country of the United States to make documentary shorts or training films, but that also feels worthy of its own video. Even though those PSAs are extremely interesting and the war footage Ford would shoot was incredible, winning him 2 more Oscars, I would argue that Ford's war films are among his weakest works. Sex Hygiene, for example, being a 30-minute short film Ford made for the Army about how servicemen can avoid contracting syphilis, is one of the strangest pieces of media I've watched in the entirety of this YouTube channel. And yes, John Ford was a legend for hitching a ride with servicemen so we could film the Battle of Midway on ground level, but even that didn't grab me the way Grandpa Joe talking about grapes did.
Maybe I'll get me a whole wash tub full of grapes and just sit in them and scrouge around in them until they're all gone. I sure would like that. I sure would like that.
Yes, the war years were interesting. The footage was incredible, and it is fascinating to compare how Ford approached the wartime changes to the film industry versus how his contemporaries did. But in this monumental video, we do have to choose certain avenues of Ford's career to breeze through. So let's move on past the war footage, and we'll only briefly stop to cover 1945's They Were Expendable, which was a war film nominated for 2 Oscars, but could really just be classified as a hollow outlet for Ford to stage detailed, accurate naval combat on film. Though a quick trivia note on They Were Expendable, Ford was credited on the film with his Navy rank and title, John Ford Captain USNR, which was one of 5 unique ways that he'd be credited across his career. And with that, we're back to Monument Valley. There's still over a dozen masterpieces to cover, and with the war in Ford's rearview mirror, the legendary director had been forever changed. In true Ford fashion, the legend returns from war and makes one of the best films of all time. My Darling Clementine is that movie, and I could talk about it for hours. Up to now, if Ford was the great poet who spent his career writing a poem on America, the stanzas have been Stagecoach, The Grapes of Wrath, Young Mr. Lincoln. But even these masterworks aren't as successful in summing up all of history in a single image. You see, Clementine is a movie about a man named Wyatt Earp and his brothers who come to this little western town called Tombstone. Before they know it, brother James has been killed, and the Earp brothers won't leave until they get revenge. Henry Fonda stars as Wyatt Earp, the brother who becomes town marshal, and he faces off against the brilliant Victor Mature as Doc Holliday. Their relationship is charged but fascinating. As I've said, single compositions populate this movie, which have more heart and soul than most directors achieve in their entire careers. The entire mythos of the American West can be found beating within stories like the gunfight at Tombstone. It's just another feather in Ford's frontier, just another film that would be most filmmakers' best. But between the images, the performances, the mythos, and more, and the fact that all of this was shot by people who had just got back from the most traumatic years of their lives, altogether contributes to My Darling Clementine being one of the most exceptional films in this legendary career, and a beautiful sign of things to come.
Oh, by God.
Funnily enough, at this point in his career, Ford was operating under a mindset of balancing out his quote-unquote prestige pictures with commercial ones. For every The Informer, there was a Wee Willie Winkie. For every The Long Voyage Home, there was a Western. But that tradition would come to an end with 1947's The Fugitive, which was meant to be a prestige picture smack dab between the Westerns My Darling Clementine and 1948's Fort Apache. But as you may guess, The Fugitive is easily the worst of those films, and was the catalyst for Ford to eliminate such a pattern. Henceforth, his commercial westerns were also art films. The Fugitive sees Fonda in his 7th collaboration with Ford, and in my opinion, it's the worst collaboration, most of all because he's disgustingly miscast as a Mexican priest who is persecuted for anti-Catholic policies. The entire film was shot with a skeleton crew, and was heavily inspired by German Expressionism. So it's a beauty to look at, but a bit of a bore. Ford himself said, "I just enjoyed looking at it." And there's no denying this movie is gorgeous. But we're lucky that it flopped so hard, for it told Ford he was wasting his time with the planned prestige pictures. When you're as talented as Pappy was, you could make paint drying seem cinematic, and so from here on out, he'd only make what he wanted to make. Which brings us to the Cavalry trilogy. Like the Man with No Name trilogy, Bergman's Trilogy of Faith, or even the Cornetto trilogy. John Ford's Cavalry trilogy is a trilogy in theme only. There are many overarching similarities between the three films, from the crew to the characters. In every film, John Wayne plays the lead, and Victor McLaglen plays a cheerfully loyal, boozy sergeant. The themes and plots, too, are so similar across the films that they've been seen by everyone as an unofficial trilogy since release. But make no mistake, Wayne plays a different character in each film, and the conflicts all stand alone. Also, all three films are fantastic. Released consecutively across 3 years, Fort Apache, She Wore a Yellow Ribbon, and Rio Grande, the informal Cavalry trilogy was born when Ford asked the young, aspiring screenwriter Frank Nugent about the cavalry. He said, "In all westerns, the cavalry rides in to the rescue of the beleaguered wagon train, or whatever, and then it rides off again. I've been thinking about it, what it was like at a cavalry post, remote, people with their own personal problems, over everything, the threat of Indians, of death. A sort of Night's Watch they were, and an excellent setup for not one, but 3 great movies." Fort Apache is tremendous. With every Ford film, I find myself saying, this is the best movie he ever made. But I'm always awestruck by another. Fort Apache follows Henry Fonda as the rigid Colonel Owen Thursday. After Thursday, along with his daughter Philadelphia, played by Shirley Temple, moved to Fort Apache, he declares at once that everyone must go to war with the Apaches. The American military is portrayed surprisingly critically, considering that they commissioned PSA after PSA from Ford earlier in the decade. But I think that's one reason this works so well. The American Indians are given a great deal of sympathy, and life at the fort comes across as nothing more than rigid and suffocating. It's Ford's greatest anti-authority film, and one that equates following blind authority with suicide. Overall, it's an endlessly complex work, but especially interesting when viewed within the context of World War II. I give it a very high recommendation. She Wore a Yellow Ribbon is immensely underrated in my opinion. It's disappointing that after Fort Apache, this film actually takes a strong pro-cavalry stance, but at the very least, it makes watching this trilogy so compelling. Furthermore, Yellow Ribbon, which follows Wayne as an aging cavalry captain on the verge of retirement, is one of the biggest tearjerkers I've seen in a long while. There's a graveyard scene that will probably make you cry, and at this point, it feels redundant to mention how gorgeous this movie is to look at, but yet again, composition after composition will strike you as the most beautiful images ever put to film. This movie is full of Technicolor beauty, leading up to one of the best closing shots of all time. It's also my grandpa's personal favorite Ford film. My mom said he used to play it on repeat, and they had to try to retrieve the remote control from him while he was asleep to change the channel. In my opinion, though, it's probably the worst of the trilogy. Nothing really happens, and there are some egregious bits of old-fashioned imagery. A Confederate flag is photographed a tad too beautifully, and the supporting characters are all too cartoonish. For those reasons, it's not on the same level of its predecessor or its successor. Still, though, Wayne excels, images soar, and tears fall, altogether amounting to a solid Western which I'd also recommend. Finally, Rio Grande may not be as good as Fort Apache, but it also has its supporters. Orson Welles called it a masterpiece, and the story goes that Republic Pictures only agreed to finance Ford's Irish Odyssey, The Quiet Man, which he actually cared about and would make his next project, in exchange for this Western. But for all the stories of a director pumping out one film in exchange to make another, this is one of the best. Rio Grande sees Wayne playing Colonel Kirby York, not to be confused with his character Kirby York in Fort Apache. As I said, this really is an informal trilogy. He's a good colonel, but his cavalry is in desperate need of more troops. 18 are sent to him, including his long-lost son Jefferson, accompanied by his mom, Wayne's old fling, Kathleen. She's portrayed by Maureen O'Hara, the Irish actress who Ford punched and probably loved, and it's her rekindled relationship with Wayne which really makes this film. Rio Grande doesn't have the strong messaging of Fort, nor the visual splendor of Ribbon, but for my money, it's got enough of each of those to be a fitting feather in the Cavalry Trilogy cap, and on the whole, these films are must-sees. Ultimately, what I love about the Cavalry Trilogy is how they really opened the floodgates for Ford to confront how he wanted to film Native Americans. For a filmmaker who really wrote the myth of the American West, cowboys are just as key players as the American Indians were. With the Cavalry Trilogy, Ford demonstrated a newfound sympathy for the Native Americans and his understanding of the tensions they faced. It's the kind of sympathy which embodied a lot of post-war Ford conflicts, wherein a movie like My Darling Clementine offers up a glimpse at Earp and Holiday bonding over Shakespeare. This is a far cry from how Native Americans were depicted in pre-war Ford films, like By Indian Post or even Stagecoach. It's still not perfect, but Ford was making improvements. Further proof of the post-war liberalism of Ford comes from the anecdote surrounding 1949's Pinky. Pinky is a film which you won't find covered in nearly any John Ford book or documentary, as it's an Elia Kazan picture which Ford only worked on for one day. But I want this video to be exhaustive in its coverage, and even the greatest Ford aficionados to walk away learning something new. So in 1949, you should know that Ford faked shingles to get out of directing a Fox film called Pinky, and the incredible Elia Kazan took his place. The movie went on to be nominated for 3 Academy Awards, but it's perhaps best remembered as one of the most racist movies of all time. A white woman, Jean Crane, plays a black woman who's so light-skinned that she passes as white. She lies about her heritage, falls in love with a white doctor, and must eventually confess to him that she's black. Yet, thankfully, he still loves her in the end. This was not a happy ending to some, however, and a small movie theater in Marshall, Texas actually banned the film. The theater owner, W.L. Getling, decided to exhibit the film in protest and was convicted of a misdemeanor. He fought the conviction, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court, who decided in 1952 that the First Amendment extended to movies. Gelling's conviction was overturned on the basis that Pinky had every right to have been shown. Pinky is a weird footnote in both film history and the history of law, but in any case, it was not a good movie, and Ford jumped ship after one day because he hated it so much. Certainly, the films Ford made would only become more progressive over time. One film Ford didn't hate making, however, was his 1948 Western, Three Godfathers. I talked about this film in the last video, but again, it was notable as the first time that Harry Carey Jr. was offered a leading role in a Ford film, a year after his father's premature death. I really like Three Godfathers, which attempts to retell the biblical tale of the three wise men in a Western context, but in the best possible way, nothing compares to its moving opening image. The 1950s was Ford's last decade at full ability. We'll discuss more in a bit why, but after a series of circumstances in 1959, the director would never be the same. It was a roller coaster of a decade for Ford, with a few more war documentaries, a few more of the best westerns and best movies of all time, and a brief foray into comedies and an anthology film, which was as unexpected as they were amazing to uncover. This is Korea, and The Red, White, and Blue Line were the documentaries. Though it's fascinating to see a color documentary with early footage of the Korean War, there isn't much to This is Korea. There's nothing at all to Red, White, and Blue, which was a propaganda film about buying war bonds. The comedies were When Willie Comes Marching Home, which is actually hilariously out of place in Ford's career, as it featured musical numbers.
You kissed me one day, then seeing that I was true about it.
No actors whom he ever worked with prior to or following this film, and was only 82 minutes long. I couldn't even find it for the purposes of this retrospective, but the internet assures me I'm not missing much. Gideon's Day was another strange one, a comedy about a wacky day in the life of an English detective. It was funny, but funny in the way that you won't remember 5 hours after watching.
You made one big mistake, Inspector. You came into this house alone.
Mr. Roberts was the only good comedy, but it was just Ford adapting an already funny stage play. He also co-directed it with Mervyn LeRoy and Joshua Logan. So when compared to the already great number of films I'd implore you to watch, this is one of the least essential Ford films. Finally, The Rising of the Moon is the aforementioned anthology film, following 3 vignettes of Irish country life. It feels like a great love letter to Ford's home, and all 3 stories were actually quite good. I'd say it's worth watching, and for those of you going through Ford's career and looking for a brief reprieve from Monument Valley, check it out. The Growler story was Ford's try at a short submarine film in '57, and though it's too much propaganda for my liking, there's no mistaking that even in 20 minutes, Ford could craft a compelling drama. There were also 2 less important war movies, The Wings of Eagles and What Price Glory, but I would say each have elements which are far better in other Ford films. For Eagles, it's John Wayne as a Navy man who really wants to be a screenwriter. The character here is Frank Weed, a real person, but I found him and Wayne's performance to be a lot less compelling than Ole Olsen in Ford's prior The Long Voyage Home. And for What Price Glory, you're just getting a below-average story about 2 military men at odds, their rivalry growing and growing and growing until they must learn to work together on the battlefield. Ford did it better with silent films. But that leaves the 7 truly great films of the 50s, in my opinion, which I'm going to talk about from least favorite to favorite. Number 7. The Last Hurrah is a movie about aging. Spencer Tracy plays Frank Skeffington, a former governor and Irish American who wants to run one last time for mayor. I'm putting it 7th on this mini ranking, but there really isn't anything wrong with this film, and Tracy is actually tremendous in the leading role. Honestly, it just comes down to personal preference, and political dramas aren't really my things. Additionally, Skeffington's foes in the race are more caricatures than characters, with one of the worst being a member of the KKK who dropped them because he couldn't afford his robes. At least this character is portrayed undeniably as a villain and a buffoon. There are still moments of Ford's expertise here, though, and I think a lot of people would like this movie more than me. My favorite scene involves Skeffington and his nephew taking a trip down memory lane together, stopping at a wooden post where Skeffington and his deceased wife had carved their initials while dating. Now that's all he has left of her. Aging has truly become one of Ford's most prominent and most deft themes. Number 6, Magambo, once again is definitely underrated amongst Ford's canon, but not as much as 2 films I'll discuss soon. It stars Clark Gable, Ava Gardner, Grace Kelly, and was shot in Africa, so right away it stands out amongst Ford's filmography in many ways. And a lot of people have a soft spot for it for that very reason. But in my opinion, all that those metrics amount to are some great scenery and some sad, wasted potential. Gardner is good, Gable and Kelly really aren't, and the ending of Magambo is one of the worst of Ford's entire career. I'd say you should watch it, however, and that it's arguably a masterpiece because you have Ford's trademark eye for compositions bringing the underseen landmarks of Africa to life. Some people rate this really highly, but it's not as good, in my opinion, as number 5. The record-setting 4th Oscar for Best Director. You may have noticed, Ford won all his Oscars for exclusively non-Western films, were Frank Capra and William Wyler, who of course are both long gone now. And the list of 2-time winners doesn't seem too bound for a 3rd win anytime soon. Additionally, number 4, The Sun Shines Bright. The Sun Shines Bright from 1953 is an oft-forgotten Ford film, but the legend himself ranked this as his personal favorite movie he ever made. He also said that about The Fugitive and Wagon Master, though, so take it as you may. It's a remake of the earlier Ford film Judge Priest, which you may remember as being my second favorite of the unofficial Will Rogers trilogy. And while almost everyone agrees that it's better than the original, I don't know if I'd agree. There are some wooden performances, particularly from the younger actors, and Charles Winnegar's portrayal of the novel character Priest isn't nearly as strong as Will Rogers was. With that being said, the reason Ford remade this was because in the earlier version of the film, 2 scenes were cut by censors, an anti-lynching scene and a prostitute's funeral. Their inclusion here is what makes The Sun Shines Bright so great. The latter scene in particular is steady, meticulous, perfect choreography, as is so characteristic of Ford, and one of the best, largely wordless scenes in all of cinema. The film's ending, too, is spectacular. Another politically charged liberal ending which sees black citizens and white citizens walking in opposite directions into the night, but they say that the sun shines bright and intolerance won't last forever. It's easy to see why Ford considered this to be the best movie he ever made. The Fordian themes of community, sympathy, division, and togetherness all are here in spades, and the two aforementioned sequences which Ford always wanted in his Will Rogers film are so well done that it must have been a huge personal triumph for the aging filmmaker. The Sun Shines Bright is a masterpiece, no doubt about it, and a great starting point for those just diving into Ford's career. Number 3, The Searchers, 1956. I'm sure this will be made, and the best Western ever made. But yet, it's only my third favorite, but yet it probably doesn't even crack my top 5. For what it is, though, it's the perfect end to an era. Number 2, The Long Gray Line. Wow, what a film. In my research, I almost never saw this film brought up, so I wasn't expecting at all the masterpiece that unfolded. Its being there meets the life and death of Colonel Blimp, but perhaps better than both of those films. Marty Maher is an Irish immigrant who goes to West Point to avoid paying for some broken dishes, but ends up staying there for over 50 years. He becomes a father figure for the young cadets there, and as time marches forward, so too does Marty's collection of yearbooks grow, each filled with black tape for every cadet who didn't return. All of Marty's trainees become his friends, and as the cycle of time sees these men go off to war, die, or have children, and their offspring meeting the same fate, Ford seeks to question the meaning of life. The Long Gray Line hits 50 years and 140 minutes, and returns to the humanism of his best post-war films to make an opus on aging and the military's flaws. It's unfortunate that so many people write Ford off as a racist or conservative old man, when he really couldn't be further from it. He served, sure, but he had his reservations about the military and heroism. And time again, his films confront these hypocrisies in such an artful way that it's hard to not see him as the finest American poet of all time. And yet, The Long Gray Line is only my second favorite of this decade. Finally, 1950's Wagon Master is a film I saved for last for good reason. I stand by putting this ahead of The Searchers, even though I adore that film. But Wagon Master is in my top 3 films of Ford across any decade. Wagon Master focuses on drifters of the American West, but now the characters entering Ford's frontier canon are Mormons, a group he's never touched on before. That's not incredibly important to the narrative, but I think it ties into the other points that I've made in this video so far. Here, the resounding Catholic Ford instills a sense of humanity in yet another group he never focused on prior to the war. Wagon Master is a very simple film, following the pacifist Mormons as they make their journey to the utopian America they seek. There are conflicts, of course, primarily with the Navajo Indians in this film, but they're never matched with violence. This is a humanitarian effort from Ford, with no above-the-title actors and no grand shootout. As film critic Kay Reynolds contextualizes it, Wagon Master didn't ring many bells when it first released. Critics and viewers were lukewarm because it was so different from the usual Western. The cowboys were workers, not gunslingers. Set post-Civil War and post-World War II, these are men who want to leave war behind. Indians are presented in a positive light, and the story's emphasis is on hard work, good deeds, and family. Yet that's what makes it so exceptional. As we've discussed a number of times in this video, films like these were the marks of Ford post-war. And whilst his incredible eye for composition did wonders for the electric, genre-birthing westerns he put out in the first half of his career, I much prefer the quiet films of the second half. Films where a Mormon priest asks a prostitute to dance, for instance, because in a movie like Wagon Master, the folk dance after finding water is something which everyone's a part of. This is truly one of the best films Ford ever made, and I'd recommend it to a number of people, but in particular fans of Star Trek. When Star Trek creator Gene Roddenberry pitched his space adventure series to the networks, he described it as Wagon Master to the stars. And for that fact alone, I find Wagon Master to be one of Ford's greatest films, and surprisingly, his best film of the 1950s. We're now transitioning into the 1960s, and as the chapter title indicates, these were Ford's final years. Although he would live until 1973, Ford only really made 6 films in the final 13 years of his life. The beginnings of the end, as alluded to before, came in 1959 with the western The Horse Soldiers. It was a Civil War movie, and the on-screen conflict between William Holden and John Wayne was mirrored by an off-screen hatred between the two actors who fought constantly on set. Also, during filming, Wayne's wife, Pilar Paulette, was battling a barbiturate addiction, and she attempted suicide while on location. The problems peaked when Fred Kennedy, a stuntman who had worked with Ford since she wore a yellow ribbon, tragically died from falling off a horse during the film's climactic battle scene. The year after the Horse Soldiers, Ford lost another dear friend, Ward Bond. He was a character actor with many memorable roles, from The Maltese Falcon to It's a Wonderful Life, but we haven't talked about him yet because his story in Ford's life is more relevant off-screen than on. The two of them and John Wayne were best friends. His death in 1960, coupled with the stuntman death, attempted suicide of Pilar Paulette, and awful bickering between Wayne and Holden on Horse Soldiers, all contributed to the beginnings of a fabled end. Pappy could have gone forever, but it was getting harder for him, and so those last 6 movies across his final 13 years were Sergeant Rutledge, Two Rode Together, Donovan's Reef, Cheyenne Autumn, 7 Women, and The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. Sergeant Rutledge is often cited as the most thought-provoking film Ford ever made. Following a black cavalry sergeant who's been accused of raping and killing a white woman and murdering her father, Sergeant Rutledge continues the great streak of moralistic play movies which Ford made in his late career. Rutledge is often discussed over one key point. Is it an ill-made attempt or not? This is something I haven't quite decided for myself yet, but I do commend Ford for even trying to make a strong black lead, and especially in a setting which precedes the publishing of To Kill a Mockingbird by 2 months. This was an apologetic film, a focus on the Buffalo Soldier African-American cavalry regiments, which were completely ignored in all of Ford's other cavalry films. And while the true biographical story of Sergeant Braxton Rutledge doesn't compare to the way Ford gave Abraham Lincoln or even Marty Maher a biopic, there's the usual painteresque qualities to Ford's compositions which are so welcome to Rutledge's story. And considering all that, I think that the dignity and beauty of this film more than make up for the framing of this black sergeant's story through courtroom flashbacks. Two Rode Together in 1961 is, yet again, one that people cite as the best film Ford ever made. At this point, I hope you aren't tired of hearing that, because Ford's final 4 films have all earned that title from various critics too. Pappy didn't go out quietly, and Two Rode Together is a really great pseudo-sequel to The Searchers, which follows how Comanche hostages reintegrate themselves into society. In essence, what Natalie Wood did the moment Wayne left their door. It's a very bitter film, which seems to argue that everyone is corrupt, whites as well as the Comanches, and it is required viewing for anyone who argues that The Searchers was racist. Ford is as anti-prejudice as anyone here. Especially when comparing Ford to his earlier self, it's hard to see how people can claim that Ford was an old-fashioned conservative through the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Watching through Ford movies is like watching a creator birth a whole mythology, and then attack it from every last angle. Even My Darling Clementine's famous image of Fonda leaning back on a porch is subverted here in the opening scene, as Jimmy Stewart replicates it, and then reveals himself to be cast against type as an immoral marshal. Two Rode Together even rips apart the scenery which Ford so often chewed, and still finds beauty in mostly dull, dead, and pessimistic compositions. You could almost call this an anti-John Ford film. I call it perfect. Donovan's Reef is further proof of Ford's interest in the history of assimilation and the idea of a melting pot. It reads as a Polynesian comedy with wacky characters coming together in hilarious ways. But Ford directed it, so we get more Lubitsch than Lewis. My favorite scene is when a Christmas pageant has to stop midway through as rain is leaking through the church roof and drenching everyone. The King of Polynesia, the Emperor of China, and the King of America, all with their ethnic congregations, have to stop their rendition of Silent Night until the Australian soldiers in the audience pull out umbrellas and keep on singing. Ford holds on the composition of all of these people from different backgrounds, united against the rain, and that scene is transcendent. The fact that this is still just a lesser comedy in Ford's filmography makes it all the more impactful for me. He's a filmmaker who consistently understands the themes, images, and emotions. And even late in his career, Ford is still surprising us. Cheyenne Autumn was Ford's penultimate film, and although I'm saving one from 1962 for last, I love that Cheyenne Autumn was the film which closed the book on Monument Valley by giving it back to the American Indians. Like with Sergeant Rutledge, Ford's progressive vision doesn't entirely work, but this is anything but hollow, and the eye with which Ford frames the Cheyenne Native Americans is as sympathetic as any. This is a tad overlong and a tad boring, but come for the closing 70mm photographs of the American West and stay for the resounding empathy and understanding from a filmmaker who truly understood the world and its bloodshed. Made 2 years later, Seven Women was John Ford's final film, and for my money, one of the greatest final films ever made. Set in rural China, it follows 6 religious women and a Christian missionary who are in much need of a doctor. When said doctor arrives at last, they're shocked to find how much she disdains religion by smoking, wearing pants, and fighting with the head of the missionary. Played by Anne Bancroft, Dr. Cartwright is one of the finest female protagonists ever put to film. And without spoiling the ending, Ford uses her character to make one last postulation on heroism. Finally, we jump back 4 years to The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, which is widely seen as Ford's best film, and may personally be my first place favorite out of the 87 Ford films we've talked about thus far. It's more Sergio Leone than it is in the violent, bleak spaghetti westerns which his Italian contemporaries had borne. James Stewart, John Wayne, Lee Marvin, and Lee Van Cleef. These are the legends of not just westerns colliding, but of the entire silver screen. I'm not talking too much about it, as I've talked about enough of so many other Ford films, and I think this is one that you deserve to experience yourself. But I do want to leave you with one nugget from this film, which I feel exemplifies the thesis of my first video and the legend of John Ford.
This is the West, sir. When the legend becomes fact, print the legend.
Now, for the sake of being exhaustive, I should mention that these years also saw Ford contribute segments to How the West Was Won, which is a movie I'll probably do a whole video on at some point, as well as a baseball TV movie, or maybe it's an episode as it's only 50 minutes, called Flashing Spikes. It's actually super surprising how forgotten this film is, considering it starred Jimmy Stewart, Jack Warden, John Wayne, and his son Patrick, Harry Carey Jr., and even Fred Astaire as the narrator. But alas, it's not even watchable now. Then Ford made a film in 1965 called Young Cassidy, but credit for its direction was strangely given to cinematographer Jack Cardiff. And finally, a documentary which Ford never completed on a U.S. Marine that was called Chesty, a Tribute to a Legend. But with that, at long last, John Ford is done. We used to be a triumvirate, Ford and me and a guy named Ward Bond, Wayne said. The day I went to Palm Springs, Ford said, "Duke, do you ever think of Ward?" "All the time," I said. "Well, let's have a drink to Ward," he said. So I got out the brandy, gave him a sip, and took one for myself. "All right, Duke," he said finally. "I think I'll rest for a while." I went home, and that was Pappy Ford's last day. On August 31st, 1973, John Ford died of cancer. He had been an excessive drinker and smoker his entire life, contributing to the stomach cancer which finally did him in. But his legend lives on. 108 years ago, Ford came to Hollywood, and what he accomplished there is still being appreciated and evaluated to this day. If you take anything away from my own exhaustive contribution to the legend of John Ford, I hope that it's that Ford isn't just your grandpa's favorite filmmaker. His westerns, comedies, dramas, and romances are fresher and more important than most films released today. And whether it's today or tomorrow or 20 years from now, I hope you'll put on a movie by old Pappy. I've given you a few to consider. But until the next time, I'll see you at the movies.